Okay, hello
All right.
everyone, and welcome to the 2017 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. My name is Lori George, and I am one of the Local Food Systems and Small Farms educators, and I'm housed down here in Mount Vernon, Illinois, which is in the south central part of the state. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we will do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. I know this is a tight frame to do for our educators to deliver these in-depth information, so please understand why we are limiting our questions to the text box at the left during the presentation. I will do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows. The presentation will be recorded, and I will email a link, or Andy will email a link to the archived presentation as soon as possible after this concludes. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation of this presentation, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. So this week's presentation is from Dave Shiley, one of my fellow extension educators stationed in Coles County. He has degrees from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, majoring in forestry, outdoor recreation, resource management. He has also completed advanced coursework in natural resources and wildlife ecology at the University of Illinois. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Lori. Glad to be here today. So today we're going to talk about windbreaks, and there are a lot of ways that we can design a windbreak, and it really ends up being determined by the goals for your farmstead windbreak. You see on that slide lots of different reasons we might install a farmstead windbreak. A lot of people put that in there because of energy conservation, so we're managing the wind, trying to reduce that impact, winter wind impact in our home, keep our livestock warmer, so we can put it near a feedlot. We might also enhance that farmstead windbreak for wildlife habitat. It also is going to provide some recreational opportunities perhaps on the farm. It's going to be more comfortable in your yard during the wintertime for sure, but wildlife viewing, and then of course aesthetics that just looks a little bit more pleasing in terms of green space on your farm. There are several factors that we need to think about and understand how you can increase the effectiveness of that windbreak, or maybe why your windbreak currently isn't working. So evaluating it based on the height of the trees, the density of the windbreak, its orientation to the winter prevailing winds, which we're trying to control, and the width of the windbreak, the length of the windbreak sides, and species composition. So we'll talk about all these. And so that I don't forget to mention that in terms of orientation to prevailing winds, we want to think about the summer winds. So in most cases, you need to not put a windbreak to block some of those winds in the summertime, so that we are still getting that cooling effect from the summer winds. So out of that list, tree height is the most important factor that's going to determine the area of downwind protection. So, and we actually will see wind speed reductions on both sides of the windbreak, both on the windward side, approximately 2 to 5 times the height of the windbreak. So when it talks about the height, when you're looking at the effect of a windbreak, we're talking about mature height of that tree species or species within that windbreak. And then on the downwind side, the leeward side, you're going to see some protection up to 30 times the mature height of that windbreak, but the best zone of protection is going to be within 10 times that mature height. The width of the windbreak is also one of those factors, but it's probably less important than density. There's actually been some research that looked at, how many rows are necessary in a farmstead windbreak, and there's some research from Princeton that looked at a declining effect of additional rows. So 2 is kind of the optimal width, but three rows in that windbreak, as in this picture, is certainly a good way to do that, to maintain density, because density is really the key factor in reducing winds on the leeward side. Tree density is also affected by the species you're planting. So you can see that spruce, fir, and arborvitae have are a little bit slower growing species, so therefore their density is going to be higher. So at about 90% if they're healthy and well spaced. Pine, as they may be dense when you first plant them, are smaller, but as they mature, then their mature density is, depending on the species, 40 to 65%. So when we combine those, then we're shooting for a farmstead windbreak, if we're looking at energy conservation or protection of livestock in a feedlot, of about 65 to 80%. We're really trying to stop that wind, block the wind flow, and that's the optimal density. In this slide, you can kind of compare some of the densities in this young windbreak. These trees are about 8 to 9 feet tall, and on the inside row are spruce. In fact, they're Norway spruce. And you can see that density, except at the top, the density of that tree as it grows stays pretty tight. The internal needles or leaves are persistent. With pines on that outside row, or white pines actually, and we'll see some slides here in a minute of additional pictures of white pine, the 3-year-old needles actually fall off. So a lot of people think that white pine is dying in the fall, but actually the 3-year-old needles are falling off. So therefore it loses some of that density, and most of our pine species are faster growing species, so the whorls of branches are further apart. Another consideration is, what direction is that winter wind coming from? So generally speaking, in Illinois, from the winter winds coming from the northwest headed to the southeast, there are some locations that vary in Illinois. We have more direct west wind heading directly east. We also have a few locations in Illinois, if you look at a prevailing wind map, that the prevailing winds are actually coming from the south. So if you don't have a windbreak, you're thinking about putting one in, then that's an important thing to look at, that the data from the Illinois State Water Survey, the climatology data, what direction are your winter winds coming from in your particular locale. And then we're going to lay out that windbreak that's going to be perpendicular to the prevailing winter winds, or at a right angle to those winter winds. So that's location. Then length. The length of the windbreak is going to determine how far or how big of an area, it's referred to as a zone of protection. How big of an area is that windbreak actually going to work? So the windbreak side should extend about 50 feet past the area that you're trying to protect. In this case, this house. So let's take a look at a little bit more how that really works. So oftentimes you'll see a one-sided windbreak, and maybe that's what you have currently, one leg. And obviously the zone of protection is going to kind of be in the shape of a triangle. As you get further away from that row of trees, then the wind's going to come around the sides, the ends of that windbreak, and make kind of a cone or area of protection. If we add a second leg to that, so in this case, you can think about that row at the top being east-west, the other one north-south, as we're trying to protect most areas in Illinois from that wind that's coming from the northwest and heading southeast, or directly north. And you can see that the zone of protection then is a little bit different shape, right? So a two-legged windbreak, or if your winds are variable, then it might be better to consider putting in a second leg rather than just a one-sided windbreak. And then how close, let's say you've got an area you're trying to protect, how close is the ideal location to place that windbreak? In this case, you can see that they've got the primary windbreak, so you can think about 100 feet, so 10 times the mature height. So most of our tree species, you think about a 30-foot tall tree, then or 60 foot, 30 to 60, depending on the species, but about 100 feet to the area you're trying to protect. So when we're evaluating, in this slide, we're looking from the west towards the east, and on this farmstead, you can see the house. Now, if the zone of protection, remember that leg I indicated earlier, should be about 50 feet past the area you're trying to protect. So although there are some hardwood species, deciduous species that are planted that kind of extend that leg, the conifer rows for winter protection are really stopping well short of the area. So inside that homeowner's backyard is in the zone of protection. The house likely is not, unless their wind is coming primarily from the north, then it might be offered some protection. But in this case, you want to extend the leg to increase the size of the zone of protection.
Dave, I do have a question. Can you ever have 3 legs other than just those 2?
Well, a three-legged windbreak, you just want to be careful that you're not cutting off that summer breeze, right? So I do know that, in fact, I've got a relative that had a Christmas tree farm that they had a 3-legged windbreak just to create an environment in the wintertime that was even a little bit warmer, but they left that south end open, primarily southerly breeze in the summertime coming from the south, and it was adequate. The air can get a little bit stagnant in that in the summertime, but just need to be careful you're not blocking the summer winds.
Thank you.
Okay, and then often get questions about, what should I plant? In general, this is a row of arborvitae or northern white cedar. There's different varieties of arborvitae. So when you're purchasing arborvitae, you need to look at the mature height and the diameter of that tree. But in this case, those trees were all planted at the same time. There's a deciduous tree that's adjacent to that as it grew, it was shading out part of this windbreak, and you can see the impact of shading. They're not tolerant of shade, they're intolerant. So when you talk about tree species, they're tolerant or intolerant, that term alone is really talking about shade. Are they tolerant of shade like a sugar maple, or are they intolerant, more like an oak? So all of our conifers, all of our trees that are evergreen would be a conifer, are not tolerant of shade, intolerant. So that's one consideration. What are we going to put in there? And that's related to spacing that we're going to talk about. The other thing that, what tree is best for your location, you need to look at the soil type. So within that, once you determine where do I need to put these legs or leg of the windbreak to protect the area I'm trying to protect, and then what's the soil type? So remember that soil type varies. You might have a soil that is well drained in one location at the one end of the windbreak, and then right in the middle, all of a sudden you've got a low spot. So if you planted eastern white pine as an example throughout in an entire row of that windbreak, and you went through a low spot, you would kind of question, well, I wonder what happened to these trees, because they wouldn't grow very well or they might die. So there are several conifer species that don't tolerate poorly drained soils. So northern white cedar would be an exception to that. If you have a low spot, then that may be where specifically your planting species are going to do a little bit better in that poorly drained, location. Of course, you can also change the drainage prior to planting. The other thing that you need to think about besides species or location is of course utilities. Now, out in a rural area, we may not have as big a concern, but there are buried utilities, so you need to make sure that you are calling ahead of time to have those marked before you start any kind of planting project. Okay, other species. So let's take a look at a couple species that you might consider. Everybody likes blue spruce because of that needle color. And look at the density of these two blue spruce in the foreground of that picture. Very dense. They do have very sharp needle tips. So when you're mowing around those, it can be a little bit of an irritation. Blue spruce also has, along with many of other spruce in Illinois, have multiple disease problems. So if you want to plant some blue spruce, think about diversity. So don't plant all blue spruce. So if a disease, a canker comes through, you don't lose all of your trees. So mix it with some other spruce species. So this would be one that may want to consider. Norway spruce. Norway, all the old windbreaks. If you drive throughout Illinois, and even in adjacent states, you'll see these very large windbreaks oftentimes, and the branches of those trees have big swooping, the tips swoop towards the sky, and most of the smaller branches hang down. So it's very dramatic, kind of looks like the typical Christmas tree you might think about. That's a Norway spruce. And they were used a lot back in the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s as a windbreak planting in Illinois. But Norway spruce is pretty tolerant of some of the diseases that affect blue spruce. So that's another option for you. Here's another one that needle color looks very similar to blue spruce. So there are different cultivars. So depending on the source, some white spruce have a little bit greener needles. So if you plant some white spruce and you think back to this slide and think, well, my tree looks mainly more green than that. There are different cultivars that have more of a blue-green tint than green. So there is some variation with white spruce. But white spruce has a little bit shorter needle than blue spruce, and the tips of those needles are a little more gentle on the skin, they're not quite as sharp. So this would be another one to incorporate into your windbreak to get that density. Remember, shooting for 65 to 80% density. A tree that's not commonly planted that you can see the needle color looks very much like blue spruce is white fir. So fir there's several fir species. White fir is a longer needled, about an inch long needled fir. It's not, of course, like most of our conifers we're using in these windbreak plantings we've talked about so far are not native to Illinois, but it does pretty well. We could also incorporate balsam fir and Douglas fir. Douglas fir does have a couple of diseases that affect it, but Again, diversity, Another species that is native that you might include is eastern red cedar. So eastern red cedar is a pretty slow-growing tree. That's in the front of this picture. You can see very, very dense. It is native. It is also not tolerant of shading. So if you see an eastern red cedar in a forest situation, it can tolerate some shading. The growth is going to slow down even more, and you're going to see it a little bit sparser, right? Because those branches are going to extend towards the sun, and so you lose a lot of that density. But eastern red cedar is a good choice, especially if you're thinking about what other benefits besides wind conservation. When we talk about wildlife, that wildlife benefits, this may be one that you consider adding to the mix. You can see that brown thing in the middle of that mass of branches. That's the portion of a disease called cedar apple rust that you'll see pop up on your cedar trees. So the one time that you wouldn't want to purposely add eastern red cedar to your farmstead is if you're trying to grow apples. So there is a disease that all rusts have two different hosts. In this case, the eastern red cedar and apple species. So this jumps over to things like hawthorn, crabapple, as well as our apple fruit trees we're trying to grow for food production. So the problem or challenge is if you are converting or maximizing your windbreak for wildlife, and eastern red cedar is easily deposited in the feces of birds because they eat those seeds. That's why it's a beneficial plant for birds. It's the most common conifer of tree size in the eastern half of the United States. So it is one that you may work at getting rid of, removing from your farmstead if you're trying to grow apples. And then northern white cedar, also known as arborvitae. It has, like eastern red cedar, scale-like leaves. So you can really see those leaves, in this case, are flattened. They're not sharp. And there are different species or varieties. So make sure you check to make sure you've got a species that is not a variety that's going to be 3 feet or 4 feet in diameter. So the typical northern white cedar native is a tree that gets about 8 feet in diameter. So we can use northern white cedar. We'll see an example of this. Use of this tree when we want to close the gap. We want to between trees faster, or we don't have much space. So this tree is only going to get 8, maybe to 10 feet in diameter, and so it has some other uses. Eastern white pine. So our pines, eastern white pine is commonly used, has been commonly used in windbreak plantings. And actually, if you look at our University of Illinois Extension tree selection website, this tree has been removed as a species that we might include in a windbreak because of its potential for ice damage. Eastern white pine is a tree that it grows fairly rapidly, but while it can be susceptible to wind or ice damage, a lot of the other conifers can too. So I still think that eastern white pine has its place, mixed in with other pine species. So in central northern Illinois, red pine is one that you could add as we get to the southern half of Illinois. Shortleaf pine or loblolly pine would be two species that do pretty well. Their density, again, with our pines is not as great, so a pure pine windbreak is not going to achieve the density. You can see here are a couple mature or larger white pine, and you can see that loss of density. That distance between, because white pine will get 18 to 24 inches of height growth. So the distance from and height growth is going to be from one whorl of branches to the other. And white pine is very distinct. You can see those. You actually can count the number of whorls and estimate the age of that tree by looking at those whorls of branches. So because of its fast growth, you can do some shearing of your trees in the windbreak to tighten up that density, but in most cases it's probably not going to be, it may not be practical because of the size of the windbreak. And then Scotch pine. I see a lot of Scotch pine that are dead or dying in old windbreaks. They were planted there. Scotch pine's a great Christmas tree. It's not native, but it's short-lived. In Illinois, 25 to 35 years old, and that tree is probably is on its way out. So this is not a tree that's suitable for your windbreak, but does make a pretty good Christmas tree. All right, so let's look at windbreak design options. So how can we, and there are lots of other species before I jump away from species selection. So think, we talked about the major conifers, but there are other hardwood species that we'll talk about here when we talk about wildlife that you might add. So how we're going to design that windbreak is really going to be dependent upon your goals. So we've been talking primarily about winter wind protection. We want density to protect, to slow down the wind and reduce our heating bills, improve the comfort of our home from the blast of the winter prevailing winds. We can also plant a windbreak for soil conservation. So we used to see a lot of these were planted back after we had in the 1920s, the Dust Bowl, and you saw many windbreaks being put in, Osage orange and other species that to slow down the wind coming across the field. And we'll look at that a little bit more. And then wildlife habitat. We may be wanting to provide both winter protection, but also wildlife habitat, and certainly a windbreak that where primary purpose is soil conservation could have some wildlife benefits as well. So for farmstead windbreaks, we want a minimum of 2 rows. Space the trees 16 feet apart. Why? Because remember, they are shade intolerant. So the spacing is very important, both between the rows and within the row, between trees in a row. 16 feet is, and when you're planting a tiny tree, that may seem, it's never going to close in, this is never going to serve its purpose. So if you're wanting faster closure, so here you can see a design where it's 2-legged windbreak, you kind of have to adjust the spacing in that corner a little bit to achieve that protection. But if you want faster closure, then you could do a couple of things. One, buy larger planting stock, or on the outside of this row, you could modify that and put those trees at 8-foot spacings. Use that outside row of, if you can tolerate eastern red cedar and northern white cedar, a mixed row of those 2 species, or just all northern white cedar. And that's going to close that off, and you wouldn't have to you could plant on 8-foot centers. You can also plant on 8-foot centers, so you could plant a tree every 8 feet, 16-foot rows, and then as those trees' branches begin to overlap, remove every other tree, and you're going to get a little bit faster closure and wind blockage. If you need, in this slide we're looking at, I need to get from my farm to the field on the outside of that windbreak, so I'm just going to leave a gap. And so if our prevailing winds are from the north or coming from the northwest, then we're looking at winds that are going to kind of go through that gap and be problematic. So we were going to either go around the end, as in the left farmstead, or we can stagger those. So we're leaving some space, but there you can see the legs are overlapping in both cases, to the north and to the west. So we can go in and around that. If you've got the space to do that, that's a viable option. Yeah, so how much overlap? 50 feet. So think about extending that leg past the zone of past the area we're trying to protect, 50 feet. So you can think about the overlap as a general rule of thumb, 50 feet. Right. 16, that question about 16-foot center to center. Yeah, so 16, and that spacing is 16 foot on center, right? So 16 foot on center, so the diameter of most of our spruce trees and pine trees are going to have about a 16-foot canopy or drip line. All right. So here's a situation where those trees are planted on 8-foot centers, and the branches are definitely overlapping here, and maybe it's almost a little bit too late. And you see you're losing some density. Once those needles are gone, once they've dropped out of the center of that tree, they're not going to grow back. So it's different than our deciduous tree species. So once you lose those needles, it's not going to increase its density if they've died back from well, either insects or shading. So then if you're going to plant those closer than 16 foot on centers, make sure you plan to remove those in a timely fashion. So here's just a perfect example of, this is a mixture of blue spruce and white spruce. And they are planted on 16-foot centers, and look at the density all the way to the ground. This is only a 2-row windbreak, extremely effective in blocking the wind from the winter wind protection. Just really, really well designed, well planned. Here's one that not so good. There are some pines in there that, number one, have low density to begin with, and now because of shading, we have some lower branch dieback, and we still continue to have some density up above, but we're trying to keep it warmer down near the ground, and so we have some issues with that windbreak. All right, and then the field windbreak. Then overlap. How much overlap? So when those, I would say, if I was planting and managing a windbreak, and I planted trees on 8-foot centers, planning to remove those, as soon as those branches, I couldn't walk through there without touching them, then I'd start thinking about removing those trees. So I wouldn't let them overlap much at all. As soon as they're touching, I'd go ahead and remove that center tree. Okay, so another objective, we've been talking about goals. This is a windbreak designed to reduce soil erosion. So usually it's a 1-row kind of situation, because our density, we actually want a low density planting, because it's going to, in terms of snow, we want that snow to kind of get spread out. Besides soil erosion, a field windbreak is going to drop snow and therefore increase soil moisture in that field, so we want low density field windbreaks. Slow down the wind but not block it. Let's talk for a couple minutes here about wildlife benefits. That's our goal. We want to enhance the windbreak. Either we've got an existing one or we're planning one. What can we do to increase its benefit to wildlife? So the length and the width of the windbreak. So we can think about the increase in the width. So remember I said two row windbreak for a farmstead for energy conservation is thought to be maybe optimal. So you're looking at a 3-row windbreak maybe with conifers, but definitely adding other rows of shrubs. You need to also think diversity. So you see the recommendation, at least 4 species of conifers. I would shoot for 4 species of conifers in any windbreak planting, just because of the potential. We set up a monoculture, and windbreaks don't grow overnight. So, plan to incorporate multiple species, as many as you can in any kind of a windbreak. And then some rows of shrubs. So again, multiple species, not just one species. And there's lots of different species of shrubs that are beneficial to wildlife. There are species several different species of dogwood, gray dogwood, that is going to produce a fruit. You want to think about curves. Why do we want to put curves in a windbreak for wildlife? It creates more edge effect where there's more diversity. So clump plantings, again, creating more edge or diversity. And then in addition to shrubs, some deciduous trees. So some oak scattered in there, some hackberry. Tree species are going to produce either a hard or soft mast or fruit for wildlife. After the windbreak, you need to mow to get it established, but after it is established, then you're going to discontinue mowing. So in a farmstead windbreak, we might continue to consider mowing that until we can't get the mower through there. But as soon as those trees and shrubs are established, then we might want to consider discontinuing it, allow natural regeneration of blackberry and other species that would be beneficial to wildlife, and then some additional opportunities for nesting. We can incorporate food plots, lots of things that again are going to increase the diversity of that windbreak. So here you see the original windbreak in green. So the landowner has added some rows of shrubs, some wildlife. So it's still pretty plain, right? So so even this is still pretty linear, but you can just see the diversity, the difference, and for wildlife, it's huge. Anytime you can add curves to that, and you can have a curved windbreak too. It doesn't have to be too, straight, an angled kind of a windbreak. It could be a C shape there instead of an L shape. So certainly no reason. You're still going to have that zone of protection on the inside of that. Here you can see the diversity here. It looks much different than the just plain conifers. We see some rows of deciduous trees, some shrubs. In the bottom right-hand corner of that picture, it continues into some grass plantings as well, both perennial grasses and some annual grasses or annual food plots. So that's just like the mall for a wildlife, multiple species, great diversity, going to have lots of different songbirds utilizing that habitat. Then if we want to go kind of a step further and we think about small farms, want to produce or growing, or at least my own food, fruit trees and fruiting trees and shrubs on my property, can I incorporate those into my windbreak? So I need to think about light. So on the south border of an east-west windbreak, probably in the eastern portion, you're likely to still have enough sunlight to put in fruiting trees and shrubs. But in that corner of a two-legged windbreak, it's maybe not enough. Eastern red cedar, already mentioned, you need to consider maybe not adding that to your windbreak if you're going to try to grow apple trees in that same location or on your farm. And then there can be conflicting goals, and this would be one that if you trying to create wildlife habitat in that area and small fruit production, then you may have a situation where you're trying to grow blueberries as an example within your windbreak, at the same time trying to attract birds. Then those would probably be conflicting goals. If you want to add these kind of crop areas to your windbreak, then probably on the windward side, on the outside of that windbreak, far enough away that the shading effect doesn't affect those trees. So it'd be on the north and the east side. But particularly on the north side, watch for the shading effect from the southern angle of the sun, right? And but they are going to function as a snow tripper. So if you put your windbreak too close to an area you're trying to protect, some of that snow is going to drop off and pile up against the house if you're trying to protect a house. So in those areas that are like that, problems with an old windbreak and the snow is dropping too close to the house, then they add a row of shrubs on the outside of that. I want to talk just a second about tree planting. So really, when you're planting trees into sod, there's a challenge for that tree to survive. So site preparation really needs to begin in the fall. You can either chemically remove the grasses or vegetation in areas that you might have concern about erosion. Then chemical removal is probably the best, either strip or spot treatment. And then you can mechanically till that and remove the vegetation, and then you can correct the drainage. In most cases, just select an appropriate species for those wet areas. The herbicide you use to burn down those areas, you need to think about, are there any label restrictions? What kind of species am I going to plant? Or if you're using a herbicide to control vegetation instead of mowing. So make sure you read the label. They do vary depending on the age of the tree species you plant. A 1-year-old tree might have some negative impact versus a 2- or 3-year-old tree for that particular chemical. So read the label when you're selecting that herbicide. And planting stock. I kind of mentioned planting stock, that the bigger is better if you're trying to get it well established. There's balled and burlap or container grown stock. Then we have seedling sized trees, and they're either seedling or transplanted. So they're transplanted in the nursery. So when you're buying bare root stock, then they'll say seedling, 1-year-old, or once or twice transplanted. And it'll be a bigger, more hardy, vigorous seedling, bare rooted plant. When you get those bare root trees, make sure that you are not, commonly people get them and keep the roots wet, so they take them out of the package, put them in a bucket of water. They get busy, they sit there for a week or even longer, and then the roots die. So, remove them, wet the roots, repack it. If you can't get them planted within a couple, 3 days, then heel those in. That's just basically digging a trench, shallow trench, or laying them on the ground and covering them with soil in a shady location. You don't want to put them out in the sun. Those tree roots still need to be moist if they're heeled in. Then you can pull those out and get them planted. Make sure you don't allow those roots to dry out when you're either digging a hole or using a planting bar. Make sure you can put them in a bucket of water, pull them out of that bucket, and don't let them be exposed to the air very long. Get them in the ground. With container grown or balled and burlap stock, so you get a load of trees, you're ready to go, but something happens. So make sure that you keep the soil and the root balls cool. You water them and store those trees out of direct sunlight and wind. So conifers are still going to transpire even in the wintertime, but wind damage can be an issue. kind of speed up the drying process. Well, I've got this windbreak established now. What do I need to do? I talked about controlling vegetation to get them planted. So you need to plan to remove competing vegetation either by mowing between the rows and within the rows, or herbicide is stripped within the row, at least for 3 or 4 years, so that those trees get well established. Then you can back off the vegetation management. Protect that tree from damage from livestock and wildlife browsing until it gets established. You don't need to fertilize, and then replant. So monitor if that tree drops out. Don't procrastinate and not replace it. Get a new tree. It's going to cost less when it's smaller, remember, and get it replaced. So the terminal or leader, sometimes birds on conifers, we have what's called a terminal or leader, and that's the central part of that tree. When spruce and pine first, that bud comes out and the stem elongates, then it's green, not very woody, and it snaps off easily. So birds like to hang out on those tall spots. You can put roosting posts out there that are a little bit taller than the trees in your new planting, and that reduces some of the problems with that terminal or leader break off. A couple other species of wildlife that can also need to kind of manage for in new plantings, and that's rabbits, voles, and deer. So rabbits, this is damage from rabbits. There are some taste repellents that in the wintertime, rabbits can cause some damage to some new woody plantings. So I would monitor. If you know you have a healthy rabbit population, apply. These are active ingredients. Theorem is a fungicide that's an active ingredient in one repellent for rabbits, and then capsaicin is another one. And then voles. The tree there on the right hand corner of the slide has been girdled by voles. Voles are tall grass habitat mice. They have kind of a short nose. They're a pretty good size animal, but these are the ones you see. The picture on the right hand corner of that slide is grass clipped. This is underneath the snow in a yard, but they'll clip the grass down to the ground, even in tall grass habitat areas. So you can individually protect trees. It's very meticulous. Under their conifers, it's almost impossible. So mowing is critical around these trees so that you're exposing them to predation. You can use some toxicants. The zinc phosphide in Illinois that's labeled for use for voles is a restricted use product, so you will have to have either a private or commercial applicator license, or hire someone to do that, because it has high toxicity to other wildlife, as well as the anticoagulant baits. So anticoagulants that we use for house mice, they're not going to be labeled for voles, but there are a couple of specific anticoagulants. Chlorophacinol would be one that we might use for pine voles, but in general, the anticoagulants, it takes multiple feedings to kill voles. And then deer. So depending on your location, you may have a high population of deer or deer present. The bottom left-hand picture is from antler rubbing, so probably more traumatic for your pine trees, and you want to maintain density. So definitely conflicting. So if you have deer that you're trying to get those trees well established, then you're going to have to either use an electric fence design or an area repellent. So antler rubbing or taste repellent. But antler rubbing, really the taste repellents aren't going to be effective. So these are some common taste repellents. You might see some damage in your hardwood plantings within your windbreak, but with pine, sometimes they'll eat white pine, but you're probably more concerned about antler rubbing. So area repellents, you can use those to reduce the damage, but really if you have deer, then at least a temporary electric fence to change their behavior. Beginnings antler rubbing starts September 1st or thereabouts as a rule of thumb. It's going to continue through the winter. You could remove that fencing or turn off the electric fence in March or late February. 1st of March, late February. And then repellents generally, are going to be less effective. You can see by the size, depending on the size of the deer population, availability of other foods. So just a couple other reasons why taste repellents aren't going to work as effective. And then monitor that planting for insects. So bagworms would be one that you want to make sure you're watching for. Intip, tip dieback. So there are a couple of species that will lay eggs, and the larva bore into the new terminal leader. So you lose that terminal leader, and a lateral branch from one of those whorls in a pine has to take over. So you're going to be out there, literally guiding that leader or a lateral branch to become the leader of that tree. So much more labor intensive. So monitor for insects. The University of Illinois Extension Office can help you identify that insect and help you then determine your approach to dealing with that insect. Make sure that when trees die, if they're planted on a 16-foot spacing, get them replaced. If the tree species can still get enough sun, so you have a 3-row windbreak, one drops out of the middle, you're going to need to replace that with a sizable tree. Don't put a seedling-sized tree in there, or it's never going to be able to compete for sun and probably not going to fill in that hole in your windbreak. So use larger planting stock for replacement. Talk for a second about windbreak renovation. So a lot of older windbreaks out in Illinois across the landscape, poorly designed windbreaks, and we need to kind of begin with evaluation. What's wrong with my windbreak? And so in this slide you see too close together, right? We already have learned that. The lower branches have died back. Homeowner or landowner prune those off because they're dead, and now we have a wind tunnel. Still decent density up above. It might slow down and some wind up high, and then some of those trees have just dropped out of the whole picture there, and so the house is totally exposed, right? So we looked at this one before. Extending the leg zone of protection would be the approach here. We need to add some length, if we can, to that windbreak. Here's another example where we saw good density, but the zone of protection, it is, again, that house is just right on the edge, so you're going to get some wind coming around the end of that and create a turbulent wind field right there, and you're going to have a lot of snow dumped between the end of that windbreak and probably those birch trees there closer to the house. Here's the approach that, I've got an old windbreak and not a lot of space. So they used a newly planted row of northern white cedar on the outside of that old windbreak with some plans maybe to replace the other existing rows. So as those mature, you get some additional protection, and then removing the other existing rows. And here's a couple slides to show that how that might work. So we've got an existing 2-row windbreak. We add that new row to the outside of that. Then we remove the inside row of trees, so we still have some protection from the new row, the old row. Plant our new row of trees on the inside, and then remove the existing trees, all of them, and then replace a third row if needed, right? So this may or may not work in every case because of the space available. A lot of windbreaks are planted right near the property line, so they may not be able to do that. So that in that case, you may have to remove a row and then utilize the inside row in a 2-row system. So look at that picture. So these are Norway spruce, all but the one. One is a blue spruce. And you can see the diversity. So if our goal is aesthetics, our goal is wildlife, diversity is a really important design element in a windbreak. So much more pleasing to the eye. They're still going to offer both going to offer the same density because they're spruce. And then again, this is just a great windbreak. So maintain spacing, whether irregardless of your goal. If you're trying to have a healthy conifer, a healthy spruce tree, one that's crowded and struggling to grow, is going to be more susceptible to disease problems. So, you know, maintain spacing is going to maintain good health of that tree as well. We have the University of Illinois Extension has a couple websites I encourage you to go to. The first one there, when you go to our web.extension.illinois.edu, then you're going to go to, if you just put in /forestry, you'll go to our Illinois Forestry website, and you'll see a whole library of information that might be beneficial to you outside of windbreak management. So if you find windbreaks, go to the agroforestry tab, and you'll find our Illinois windbreak manual that has some additional discussion about species selection based on soil type, based on use, that I think you'll find beneficial. If you have problems with wildlife or want to anticipate or plan for, I know I have deer, so what can I do? Go to our Living with Wildlife in Illinois website. Again, still web.extension.illinois.edu/wildlife. So two great resources on our Illinois Forestry website has links to other agroforestry, windbreak materials from adjacent states here in the Midwest. So with that, Lori, I'll see if we've got some additional questions.
Okay. You do have some questions here. One of them is they would be curious to know if any of the trees that you talked about are deer resistant in any way. Amy has a poor arborvitae that is a sacrificial tree for deer every year.
Yeah, so deer resistant plants, and you see that commonly in those of you that garden. They're advertised deer resistant plants. So it's those plants, that information is based on palatability. So studies that have been done. So a deer resistant is not truly resistant, but it's just low on their preferred food list. So I don't know of any tree species that are probably, they're going to eat most trees. A lot of the spruce, the blue spruce, they don't like because of the sharpness of that needle. But yeah, there's probably not any species that they're going to leave alone in terms of eating it. But if you have deer, I'd be more concerned, especially until you get those trees to 6 or 8 feet tall with some branches all the way to the ground, about antler rubbing, right?
Okay.
You can put to protect from antler rubbing, you can temporarily get some rebar, metal rebar, and some 3 to 4 foot long sections. Hammer those in the ground, away from the tree trunk, and then and you'll have to put about 3 of those around the tree. So, and then make sure you pull them out after that tree gets established. But if you don't want to fence it, then you can it's very labor intensive and not the cheapest thing, but that's an option.
Yeah, I've seen some of those rebars in orchards, some of the new developing orchards. So yeah, good idea. Yeah. Bob wants to know, is white cedar arborvitae also a host for apple cedar rust?
No, it's not. So you could plant that in your apple orchard or near your apple orchard without that concern. Yep.
Okay. Next one is, what is the best windbreak direction to plant in Illinois for winds, especially in regards to protecting livestock in livestock shelters?
Yeah, so again, you want to put the windbreak so the wind it's going to be perpendicular to the winter prevailing winds. Cold animals don't, their rate of gain is going to go down. They kind of may struggle to, so you're losing money at feeding that animal. So the same concept with the farmstead design we've talked about, perpendicular to the prevailing winds. If you can put a two-sided windbreak there, and have that that's out 10 times the mature height, is where you're going to receive the most benefits to your livestock as well as your house. So,
okay.
Well,
is there a guide you would recommend on non-tree windbreak options? They have 4 acres adjoined by conventional ag and do not really have sufficient space for a tree solution around my 1 acre market gardening area.
yeah. So some people have used a tall grass species, either an ornamental grass, miscanthus, that's going to get 10 or 11 feet tall, and if you can't get a shrub, or can't get a tree in there, then that's an option.
Okay. Can you use food forest pasture design as a windbreak? Best direction to get sun if necessary or avoid the wind damage?
Can you use
food forest pasture design as a windbreak? Best direction
okay.
to get
Yeah, so you could use, so kind of a silvopasture kind of design, maybe.
Yeah.
So silvopasture, so silvopasture, you could use silvopasturing, or you're using trees in your pasture, again, with kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about, to keep your animals cooler in the summer, increase their rate of gain in the summer, and then, perhaps you do some shade tolerant shrub plantings in that on the outside, towards the wind direction in the wintertime, maybe to increase the density, to reduce the effect of that, that wind chill effect, maybe.
Okay.
If I understand that question.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I think that's how I read it. How many feet between low density tree rows for soil erosion on 50 acres? Every 800 feet or so?
Okay, so so a field, kind of the field windbreak.
Right.
Yeah, so you can think about that.
Soil erosion, I believe he's looking at.
Yeah, for soil erosion, there's probably on that Illinois Forestry website, go to the agroforestry tab, and then there are a couple of good publications on there that if you'll look for field windbreak, and the recommended spacing is in that. I'd kind of defer to that publication probably, depending on your use. So, yeah.
Okay. Nancy wants to know suggestions for shrubs to add to existing 30-year-old windbreak, especially for wildlife.
So again, it kind of depends, Nancy, based on your soil type. So shrubs would be kind of the same thing, but some examples would be great dogwood would be one. High bush cranberry would be another one that you might think about. The nannyberry would be another one that you could plant in the back of the Illinois Windbreak Manual. There's some good. There's a list of species and their natural habitat. So, there's hawthorn is a small tree that is great for wildlife. There's some varieties of hawthorn. We'll get a thorn or native hawthorn. So, if you're going to plant, like hawthorn, I'd plant something that is a variety that is thornless. There's several different arrowwood species that are beneficial as well, all producing some type of fruit, so. But look at that Illinois windbreak manual, and there's a whole list of different species and the soil type that they're best planted in.
Okay. Mark wants to know the best way to get rid of bagworms.
Yeah, so bagworms this time of year is once they form that bag and they're attached, they're not moving around anymore. The only way to deal with them is to pull them off mechanically. You just go out there with a bucket, pull them off, and then smash them or burn them. When in middle of June, if you've had problems with bagworms, so remove all the adults. There's an adult inside that bag right now, adult moth. It's going to emerge and lay eggs all over your conifers. So removing as many adults as you can right now, and then spray. There's a spray, the scheduled when those, they call it the crawler stage. So it's about mid-June in Illinois.
Okay.
And that's when to spray the tree.
Okay. Talking about perpendicular winds, would the perpendicular winds be east or west or north or south?
Yeah, so for most of the state, the winter wind is coming from the northwest or west. So a north-south row of trees are going to be perpendicular, kind of, or more or less perpendicular, right? So we'd put a northwest leg on there, and then because I have some winds that might be variable coming directly from the north, I'd have my other leg would be east-west, right? So most windbreaks you'll see with one leg east-west and the one on the west side north-south.
Okay. There was another suggestion that hazel is a great bush windbreak. Hazel is, and I believe it's a native, is it not?
Yeah, hazelnut would be great. Yep.
Yep.
And it's real good. Producing a nut size, and and they're fairly dense, so they can be used as snow trippers, but yeah, that's a great wildlife food. Good suggestion.
All right. I don't see any other questions at this time. If anybody does have them, go ahead and type it into the text box. Otherwise, I'd like to thank our presenter, Dave Shiley, local food systems and small farms extension educator in Coles County, for the great information that he presented today. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. I hope you've got some information that will help you in your small farm endeavors and your wildlife endeavors. Hopefully, even something that you can put in place this year on your area. Please look for an email from us with a link to the archived webinar in the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel, as well as a very short evaluation of the webinar you just watched. We do look at your feedback, and it helps to shape our future webinars. With no other questions here, I'd like to wish you a fabulous rest of the day and a productive growing season in 2017. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you.